Today, the first chapter that I'm going to talk about is chapter 19 of the book, The Places That Scare You by Pema Chodron. And this chapter is titled Heightened Neurosis. And what she is getting at here is that she was talking about groundlessness in the previous chapter, about resting without having beliefs, resting without having expectations, and so forth. That resting in the present groundlessness, in the present moment, can actually heighten our neurosis. That, of course, we want to, as we progress along the path, to become more peaceful and have our neurosis weaken and be less and less prevalent in our lives. But that isn't actually what happens. And she's using neurosis here to mean our 5 main poisons of the mind, and then you might say variations on that, on them. And so they are attachment to what we find pleasurable, aversion to what we find unpleasant, wanting to ignore, deny, or space out things that we don't have a strong attachment or aversion for. And then jealousy, thinking that other people have a better deal than we do. And arrogance or pride, which is thinking that we are better than other people in some way or another, or maybe in all ways. This is what she's talking about, neurosis. And these can actually get stronger because we don't like being without these, you might say, crutches, these places that we go for security, to find ground to stand on, to justify who we think we are and what we are doing, and so forth. We also don't like humiliation, failing, abandonment. We don't want life to be unfair, and so forth. But when we rest in the present moment, we can experience any one of these, and not just one at a time. They can come in packs. And so what happens is that our habitual ways, our habitual patterns, can seem more secure and more comfortable. And so we tend to go back to them. So the point she's making here is that as we experience the present moment, the groundlessness of the present moment, without preconceptions and so forth, that it takes bravery to rest in that place without a foothold, as she says, or a handhold, without resorting to habitual patterns. So she says that there are 2 directions or 2 detours that we can take when this heightened neurosis gets the best of us. And by the way, I think the point is not that if you give in to the heightened neurosis, it's a problem, but that this is something to be expected and it's workable. And just because you give into it, it doesn't make you a failure or a bad person. It just means that we need to learn how to work with it better in the future. But it's not like we just keep going up and up and up on the path and we never have downs. It's going down, going up, going down, going up, going down, going up. But in the long run, you find that you are going up more than you're going down, and there's progress in that. So one of the directions that you can take to find this security in our habitual patterns is that we use the practice to reinforce what she calls our poverty mentality. And that is that inner critic that is constantly telling us how bad we are. That is constantly telling us that we're not measuring up, that we're not as good as other people, we're not as good as we are supposed to be, that we should be better, and so forth. And it's relentless. That this resting and trying to rest in groundlessness and then giving in to neurotic patterns, it just becomes one more way for us to show ourselves that we never measure up, that we'll never be good enough. And it's really important. I really can't stress this enough, how important it is for us to pay attention to that inner critic, to not ignore it or deny it, not try to shut it up, but pay attention to it, get to know it, get to know all its sly, logical tricks. Think of it as, you might say, a spin machine or a very biased commentator on a cable news network. That it's giving you fake news. And so what she says is the solution is compassionate inquiry into what's going on in our mind. The more we get to know this, the more we get to see the tricks, the less power it has over us. The clearer we see it, the more we realize that this is a dead end. It's not true. It's very biased and slanted. That she says we have to admit that we are human and that we are not perfect and that we will make mistakes. But we have Buddha nature and we can work with our mistakes. And a story that I like to use to illustrate this, many of you have heard this, but I'm going to repeat it. It is a scene that is on YouTube from The Wizard of Oz. And Dorothy and her friends have come up to the wizard's castle, and they all want something. Dorothy wants to get home to Kansas. The Cowardly Lion wants courage, and so forth. And they've heard so much about the wizard, but they've not met him. And it takes a lot of courage because what they've heard about him is frightening for them to actually go into the castle and make these requests of him. And so they go into the castle, and there is the sound of thunder booming in this huge castle room. And in the corner, there are flames shooting up to the ceiling. And everybody is shaking and afraid in Dorothy's group. Toto, on the other hand, her dog, is not afraid. He runs over to this curtain and he pulls the curtain back, and there is this gray-haired old man that is speaking to a 1930s styled microphone and has each of his hands on a lever, which he is moving. And he sees Dorothy, and Dorothy sees him, and he speaks into the microphone and says, "Don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain." And of course, this is this inner critic. This is an analogy for our inner critic. If we don't pay attention to this person, this man behind our curtain or this woman behind our curtain that is constantly criticizing us and telling us how bad we are and how we fail and are always screwing up and so forth, it will continue to dominate our lives. But once we see it for what it is, it loses its power, just like the wizard lost his power to frighten Dorothy and her friends. So what we have to do is we have to get to know this compassionate understanding of this inner critic. Sometimes it might be a wounded 10-year-old child. Sometimes it might be a wounded adult or whatever. But we need to have compassion for that inner critic. But then we have to realize that we need to make friends with it, that inner critic. But sometimes our friends give us bad advice and we don't have to follow the bad advice that inner critic is giving us. The other detour is to become arrogant and to use this training, this Bodhisattva training or warrior training, to make us feel we are special, that we are better than other people, because other people, they don't have a clue what we're doing. They're not doing what we're doing. And oh, poor them. They're so sad. They're suffering and they don't know what to do. Again, we need to get to know that voice too. And what we're doing this way, and when we take this detour, is we're distancing ourselves from this chaotic world that we live in. We're setting ourselves apart from it, putting up a barrier that I'm better than all this crap that's going on around me. And actually, she says this is the opposite of bravery, that we're actually hiding in our Bodhisattva training. She says we're using it to, she has a question. She says, are we using it, this spirituality, to bypass what scares us? So we need to gradually develop confidence that this training is liberating us, and that we can develop a confidence to let go, to experience groundlessness. And she says, actually, this feeling of discomfort or even dread can be an indication that our habitual patterns are being weakened, that we're experiencing more directly what's going on. And so we are not to avoid discomfort or even dread. So it is the boundary around our ego that is being, you might say, broken down or worn down or slowly disintegrating. And it is fear that that boundary is made of. And so it's not a problem to experience fear, but with bravery, we go into the fear. She says that the more you go into it, the more you will experience discomfort, fear, dread, and so forth. And this is a sign actually of getting out beyond our ego, beyond the boundaries of our ego that we set up. So fear and discomfort are not a problem. We just go beyond them. So gradually we learn to relax within the freshness of the moment and whatever it brings. And that we learn that we can remain open to whatever mood or emotion or thoughts we are having at the time. Again, this is not an all or nothing situation. There are going to be some moods and emotions that we can be with and not give in to fear, not go back to habitual patterns. And there are others that are going to be much more difficult to work with. And we keep working with them the best that we can. So this is all about experience things freshly and then letting go of the experience rather than grasping onto them and engage in her words, familiar neurotic patterns. So as I said earlier, she encourages us to make friends with our neurosis, with our inner critic, with our habitual patterns, are making friends with our usual way of hiding. And again, it's this compassionate relationship, this compassionate understanding. You get to know all of this about yourself without condemning yourself, with kindness rather than condemnation and anger or disgust or whatever. And so she says that this does not mean that everything is going to be okay as we get more used to being able to be with the present, that there will be plenty of problems that arise, plenty of difficulties. There will still be the 5 o'clock traffic rush if you are in a city. You'll still have to take out the garbage. The toilet will still have to be cleaned. And you'll still have to pay taxes. And because of impermanence, you're still going to die. And on and on and on. But what this does is it works with our fear of going beyond. We develop more courage, and it leads to increasing our a relative bodhicitta, which is compassion for all beings, and it increases our experience of absolute bodhicitta, which is the way things are beyond concept and conception. So that completes chapter 19. Now, the next chapter is chapter 20, and it is titled, When the Going Gets Rough. She starts out by saying the practice is not causing harm to anyone, yourself or others. Every day you do what you can to be helpful. Very simple instructions, maybe not so easy to follow. So she gives 4 methods for, as she says, quote, holding our seat. And this means providing support for the development of patience so that we can stay open to what is happening around us. The first one is, I'll just repeat these 4 techniques and then I'll go into them. The first one is not setting up the target for the arrow. Number 2 is connecting with the heart. Number 3 is seeing obstacles as teachers. And number 4 is regarding all that occur as a dream. So going back to number 1 here. Very simply, if you do not set up the target can't be hit by an arrow. So every time we respond or react with anger, we are setting ourselves up as a target to receive more anger. Another way of putting this is when you push, the world pushes back at you. In Greek mythology, there is the Hydra, which is a beast that, and not a very friendly beast. You don't want to meet a Hydra. But if you are able to cut off his head, he will grow 10 more. And anger is like that. When you put it out into the world, you create enemies. Every time you destroy an enemy, you create 10 more. So when we are angry, we just become more and more irritated by how other people are reacting towards us. If we hold our seat patiently and avoid outbursts of anger, and this is not, you might say, bottling it up, putting a cap on it. This is letting go of the anger and even forgiving what other people have done that makes you angry. So it's important, she says, that at a very personal level to understand how we create suffering for ourselves and other people with our anger, whether it be angry outbursts or slow simmering anger that only bubbles to the surface every now and then. But if we keep holding on to that anger, we will definitely create suffering for ourselves. Pema Chodron has said that anger towards another person is like drinking rat poison and expecting the rat to die. And we can turn anger inward and be angry at ourselves, which is very common. It's part of what depression is all about. And anger towards ourselves is extremely damaging to ourselves. It keeps us locked up. It keeps us from growing at all. We just wallow in this self-loathing and feeling of being incredibly bad and inferior. So number 2 is connecting with the heart. So she says in times of anger, we can connect the kindness and compassion that we already have and use it. So a person who's acting aggressively is creating their own suffering. That person is controlled by their confusion, by their neurosis. And so she says that that person is living in their own soap opera, their own self-created soap opera. So the trick here is, or the technique, I don't know if trick is the right word, let's call it the technique. The technique is to sit with that intensity of the anger and not respond to the anger, but let it help us see how that person is suffering and bring out our compassion for that person. When a person is angry at you, the Karmapa has used this analogy. If a person is beating you with a stick, do you get angry at the person or do you get angry at the stick? And of course, or maybe put it a different way, is the problem the stick or the person that is wielding the stick? And in this case, the angry person is considered a stick that is being controlled by his neurotic emotional response. And so that is the problem, the neurotic emotional response. And if we can sit with that and not give in to anger of another person. There's a story about the Buddha, that a man came to him that was very angry. And he told the Buddha how angry he was and why he was angry. And the Buddha just sat there and listened to it. And finally the man said, well, aren't you going to do something about it? And the Buddha responded, well, if you give me a present and I refuse to accept it, whose is it? And the man said, I guess it's still mine. And the Buddha just went, So we don't have to accept everything that people want to give us. Number 3 here is seeing obstacles as teachers. So you just ask yourself, this person who is scaring me or is insulting me, do I just retaliate like I have in the past? Or is there a better way? Do we hold our seat with patience? And this way we can use this type of an obstacle or situation as a teacher to help us learn how to be patient. If we can do that, we are never separate from our teacher. The world is constantly teaching us patience if we're willing to listen to it. So, as we progress, we can actually let the situation become our teacher. That we can learn to sit with edginess and impatience and to develop our courage. This isn't spacing out, disassociating and so forth. It's just being there, experiencing it fully, but letting go of it and not taking it personal. So this is how we can use difficulties and obstacles as teachers. The fourth technique here is see it like a dream. That it's really helpful to see the angry person, the anger itself, and the object of anger as all being like part of a dream. She uses the phrase lighten up, which is really easy to say. And I would recommend, shall I say, contemplating that phrase and how we can lighten up. But think about things like, why does that person trigger me when another person might not trigger you? Or the person that triggers you might not trigger another person. And questions like, why am I making a big deal out of this? So, as always, she says to look, question, investigate, be curious. And she finishes up the chapter by saying, use these skillful means today and not tomorrow.